What's up, everyone? Welcome back. Patrick here, moving on to the next example. And as I mentioned with previous examples, if you're watching this on YouTube, this here is written out in lecture notes. You can go to the description box and there will be a course link, a URL, and the lecture notes. You can print out the PDF. It's located on the website. So a company has a gross margin of 72% and a gross profit of $43,200. It also has a net profit margin of 8%. The assets and liabilities are $76,000 and $32,000 respectively. We have to find the return on equity and the return on assets. So let's quickly review what is the return on equity, return on assets. What are the components for these formulas? Well, it's basically the net income over the equity. And then return on assets is net income over assets. Just so we know what we need. And so notice that when you read the question, you're given information about both the income statement and the balance sheet. So notice that the first two sentences is about the income statement, and then the assets, liabilities, that's part of the balance sheet. So notice we're told that the company has a gross margin of 72% and a gross profit of $43,200. So as a review, what happens is we have revenue, then we have cost of goods sold, and then we end up having gross profit. And then there's some expenses, and we end up having net income at the very bottom. So that's the number we're going to be using for both of these from the income statement. And notice that out of all of these, in terms of the dollar amounts, we're only given the gross profit, which is $43,200. However, we're also given the gross margin of 72% and the net profit margin of 8%. Now, what is the gross margin? If you remember, it's basically the gross profit over the revenue, right? And if we kind of rearrange this here, notice that revenue times gross margin, if we cross multiply here, it's equal to the gross profit. And then we're also given the net profit margin. I'll label it as NM, the net margin, net profit margin of 8%, and that's equal to net income over revenue. And then if we rearrange this, we could cross multiply it. We'll have the revenue times the net profit margin is equal to net income. And so we're going to have to use both of these ratios in order to find that net income, because we're given the gross profit here, and we're given the gross margin as well. So notice that with those two, we can then find the revenue. That's going to be the only variable missing. So the first step is we have to kind of go backwards, get the revenue, and then once we have the revenue, we have the net profit margin, then we can get the net income. So then after, we can get the net income. So there's going to be two calculations we're going to do. We've got to do this calculation first here, and then this calculation. So to do that, I'm going to use this over here. So we know that revenue, let's call it X, that's what we're solving for, times 0.72, the gross margin, in decimals, is equal to the gross profit, $43,200. I'm going to erase this over here. Right, so we're solving for this X, so what we would do is we divide both sides by 0.72. And so X would be, these would cancel out, 43,200 divided by 0.72 would give us 60,000. And so that ends up being our revenue, right? Or 72% of 60,000, 0.72 times 60,000 would give us 43,200, right? And if you wanted to solve it with just the formula, you can just say 0.72 is equal to the gross profit 43,200 over the revenue, which is x, which is what we'd be solving for, and then you could cross multiply. You'd end up with 0.72x equals 43,200. You'd end up right here. Divide both sides by 0.72. So however you go about it, that revenue is 60,000. And now that we have the revenue, what we can do is we can use the revenue to find out what the net income is by using the net profit margin. So we know that the revenue, 60,000 multiplied by 8%, 8% of the revenue is going to be the net income, which is going to give us 4,800. So that's right there. Again, if you were to use the full formula, it'd be like 0.08. The net profit margin equals the net income, which is what we're solving for, over the revenue, and then from here you can just cross multiply. X would end up equaling 4,800. So whichever way you go about it, the net income is 4,800. And then remember, when you're given these margins in percentages, when you use them in the formulas, you got to convert them to decimals. Okay, so we have the numerator for both of these. It's going to be 4,800. And now really all that's left is to get the denominators. And actually, we have this denominator of 76,000 already. That's the assets. But we don't have the equity, but we can find the equity because we're given the assets and the liabilities. So if we draw out the balance sheet, we have the assets, which are 76,000. We have the liabilities, which are 32,000. And so what would the equity be? Well, it would just be 76,000 minus 32,000, which would give us 44,000. Right? Both the left side and the right side have to balance. And so the equity would be 44,000. And now notice we have all the information that we need to figure out both of those values. And when you do that in your calculator, you end up getting 0.1091 if you round to 4 decimal places for the return on equity, and then 0.0632 for the return on assets. If you want to convert that to a percentage, just move it over the decimal place over twice, or multiply this by 100, so you get 10.91%. And then over here, same thing, you get 6.32%. Right, so that's the return on equity, that's the return on assets. The return on equity is always going to be greater than the return on assets, greater than or equal to. They could both be equal if a company has no liabilities, because then the assets and the equity would be equal. But usually it's going to be greater than, because this denominator is going to be less than this numerator. All right, so first we had to do some calculations on the income statement, find the revenue from the gross profit, then from the revenue find the net income, and then we had to find the equity. And then once you have all that, you can get both the return on equity and the return on assets.